I typed in his name. There was a little more information about Mr. Johnson, but nothing that would help us. When Dad bought the property, Mr. Johnson was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Now I remember, he said. He was some kind of biologist or something. At the time, I think he had been with the service for over 20 years. This information is 10 years old. Mr. Johnson is probably retired by now. I think his wife died a long time ago. Dad's cell phone rang. Hello? Thanks for calling back, Mr. Johnson. I'd like to get together with you and talk about the meeting last night. Oh, that would be great. We'll be there at 7. He flipped the phone closed. We're meeting Mr. Johnson at Teeter's restaurant for dinner. We got to the restaurant a few minutes before 7. I was famished and wanted to order as soon as we sat down, but Dad said that we had to wait for Mr. Johnson. By 7:30, I was about ready to pass out from hunger. Maybe he got arrested, I said, and maybe the people watching him aren't the police. Who else would be watching him? Dad shrugged his shoulders. I don't know, but I don't want you asking him about it. What's going on in his personal life isn't our concern. I was about ready to disagree with him when I saw Mr. Johnson limp through the front door. He was using an unusual-looking walking stick to steady himself. It was at least 4 feet long and made out of some kind of knotty wood. Dad stood up and waved. Everyone in the restaurant turned to look at Mr. Johnson as he made his way over to the table. Thanks for coming, Mr. Johnson, Dad said, and gave him that Mom and I called his realty smile. Mr. Johnson didn't seem impressed with the smile and didn't apologize for being 45 minutes late. He stared down at me. Who's this? This is my son, Dylan. Well, scoot over, Dylan, so I can sit down. I moved over and he set the stick between us. Now that it was closer, I saw that the knots were actually miniature carvings. The head near the top of the staff was a Sasquatch. When Mr. Johnson saw me looking at it, he moved it to the other side. Mr. Johnson was in pretty good shape for an old guy. He was thin, but looked strong. If it weren't for his limp, I would have guessed that he was a long-distance runner. He had a full head of white hair and light brown eyes that darted around the restaurant like a hawk's looking for a mouse. From my side of the table, he could see everyone coming into the restaurant, which was probably why he sat down next to me. By the way he was checking out every new customer that walked through the door, I suspected he knew he was being watched. What can I do for you, Hickok? I wanted to talk to you about the Sasquatch. I saw you at the meeting last night, he said. What about them? We were just about ready to order some food. Dad said, would you like something? I guess he didn't want to discuss cryptids on an empty stomach, and neither did I. I already ate. Well, I hope you don't mind if we eat. If I don't get some food into Dylan soon, we might have a medical emergency on our hands. A young boy can't run on an empty tank, Mr. Johnson said. I'll just take a cup of tea. I ordered the biggest hamburger they had on the menu, a milkshake, a plate of fries, and a slice of apple pie with vanilla ice cream. So what do you want to know? Mr. Johnson asked after the waiter walked away with our orders. I'm a little new to all this, Dad started out. You seem to have a strong objection to Dr. Flagg's plan. I want to hear more about why. 2 reasons. 1, I'm opposed to murder. 2, Flagg is a glory-seeking fool. He's obsessed with Sasquatch. I thought about the life-size sculpture in the backyard and wondered who was obsessed. If you don't believe me, you should have seen him this afternoon at the meeting. Meeting? Private planning meeting for the so-called shareholders. That's where I was when you came by. I showed up at Joe West to give him my $10,000, and they were all there, crowded into that little shack he has in the back of his place. They look like a bunch of kids in a clubhouse, up to no good. Joe's wife doesn't believe in the Sasquatch and won't let anyone in the house that does, except for Joe from time to time. I'm surprised that you would want to join them after what you said last night. Well, you're not the only one, Mr. Johnson said with a laugh. I shouldn't have opened my big mouth at the meeting. Probably won't be the last time. I thought I would get more support, but everyone sat there like God was talking to them from the pulpit. What happened at the meeting this afternoon? Well, they didn't take my money, if that's what you're asking. I got blackballed. They didn't want me in their club. Boo-hoo. Do you know what they're planning? They are going to hunt down a Sasquatch and kill it. If they succeed, they are going to make a lot of money and become famous. If they fail, Flagg isn't out a dime because he's not putting any dough in the pot. In fact, he's going to be paid a bucket of money as the expedition's technical advisor. I was hoping that the whole thing was a scam, a way for Flagg to make some fast cash and get a wheelbarrow full of publicity for himself. But it looks like he's really going to go after the Sasquatch this time. Dr. Flagg didn't seem interested in publicity, my dad said. Mr. Johnson laughed. What a joke. The only reason he didn't like the publicity over Clive's photos was because it didn't center around the fabulous Dr. Flagg. He wants to keep it quiet at this point so he can get more glory later. Just wait and see. The food arrived and I started wolfing it down. I guess I don't understand, Dad said. If you're against their plan, why did you try to give him $10,000? I figured that joining them was the best way to keep track of what they were doing. What are you going to do now? That remains to be seen, but enough about me. What's your interest in this whole thing? Dad looked down at his food for a few seconds. I was halfway through mine, but he hadn't touched his yet. When he looked up, he said, I saw a Sasquatch. He told Mr. Johnson the entire story. Mr. Johnson didn't blink or change his expression during Dad's strange tale. When he finished, Mr. Johnson continued to stare at him. Did you know anything about the Sasquatch before this happened, he asked. Very little. I'm curious about that shelter. How was it made? The bed was made out of a pile of small fir boughs. The top was made out of large branches leaning against the trunk of a tree. When I regained consciousness, the first thing I smelled was pitch, so the shelter was freshly made. The branches weren't cut with an axe. They looked like they had been broken off, and some of them were pretty good size. Did you see any footprints? No, but I wasn't really looking. When I came to, I was disoriented and confused. Understandable. And who have you told about this? You, Dylan, and some people at the BFI. Clyde Smithers? Dad nodded. I also told him where I had seen the Sasquatch, so that's how he found the spot. I assume so. Old Clyde doesn't have a job. He spends most of his time wandering the woods with his look-alike brothers, as if one Clyde isn't enough. They say he hasn't been quite right in the head since he got kidnapped by those aliens a few years back. Aliens? Well, so he claims. They took him up into their spaceship and transported him to a planet called Zona, where he married some kind of princess. He had a falling out with her and the king about how their child was going to be raised, so they sent him back to Earth. Mr. Johnson grinned at our shocked expressions. You know his two brothers are deaf mutes? Dad nodded. He hadn't told me about that. The rumor is that Clyde was an only child. The brothers are actually clones given to Clyde as a wedding present when he was on Zona. Apparently, they don't have vocal cords up there, which is why Clyde's clones can't talk. Clyde is about as loony as they come, but I trust him a lot more than I trust Flag. What's the connection between aliens and his interest in Sasquatch? Dad asked. Clyde claims there's a gate to Zona on Mount St. Helens, and the Sasquatch are the guardians of the gate. He wants to go back up to Zona and bring his son down to Earth. Pretty bizarre, huh? Dad didn't seem bothered by this story, which worried me quite a bit. Do you think you would be able to find this hill again? Mr. Johnson asked. I know exactly where it is. Where? I don't think I should say. I already made that mistake once, and now look what's happened. I was just curious. Mr. Johnson picked up his stick and looked at it for a moment. My advice, Hickok, is for you to forget this whole thing. Just let it go and get on with your life. That's good advice, I said. Dad looked at me. I'm not sure I can do that. Mr. Johnson nodded and stood up. I don't know what you saw, Hickok, or if you saw anything, but I do know that Flag is going to try to find and kill a Sasquatch. If I were you, I would think twice about helping him murder an animal that built a shelter for you and put you in it. I appreciate your time, Mr. Johnson. Please call me Buck. He looked at me. Both of you. One more thing, Dad said. Why are you interested in Sasquatch? We saw the sculpture in the backyard. It looked just like the animal I saw. It scared me half to death. Startling, isn't it? Keeps the neighbor kids out of the yard and the crows out of my garden. So you've seen a Sasquatch? In my dreams, Hickok, Mr. Johnson said. In my dreams. He limped out of the restaurant, leaning on his stick. We stayed at the restaurant long enough for me to finish Dad's food. On the way home, we drove by Mr. Johnson's house. A light was on inside. The house across the street was dark, but there was a green Ford Taurus in the driveway. Part 2. The Mountain. He looks at the earth, and it trembles. He touches the mountains, and they smoke. Psalms 104, verse 32. Chapter 5. What's going on, Dylan? Ever since your mom left for Egypt, you've been acting pretty weird, Doug said. We were standing outside Mr. Rhodes' classroom, where he had just watched a video about the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. The blast was heard 300 miles away, but the sound moved upward with such velocity that the people on the mountain that day didn't hear the explosion. They said the eruption was like detonating the Hiroshima bomb every second for 7.5 hours. The 60,000-foot ash plume was so violent there were lightning storms inside of it. When the bell rang, I had wandered out of class in a daze, wondering if the Sasquatch knew the mountain was going to erupt beforehand. When they felt the earthquakes in the months leading up to the eruption, did they leave the area, or did some of them stay on the mountain like the loggers, tourists, and residents who were never seen again? I kept going back and forth between believing in the Sasquatch and thinking the whole thing was some kind of hallucination. After Mr. Johnson told us about Clyde's abduction to the planet Zona, I started doubting again. But by morning I had slid back into half belief. Dad had seen something, and Mr. Johnson seemed to believe, and he didn't strike me as a fool. Dylan? Doug said. Yeah. Did you hear what I said? Sorry, I guess I blanked out. You've been blanking out for days. You haven't answered the email I sent you. You haven't been over to the house. What have you been doing? Well, I've been helping my dad with some things. So that's it? What's the madman up to now? Oh, it's nothing like that, I lied. Doug knew all about Dad's tinkering, but I wasn't about to tell him about this Sasquatch thing. I'm helping him with some of his rental properties. He has a lot of vacancies, and he's getting them ready to rent out. His new truck is awesome. Does your mom know about it? He asked with an evil grin. Doug knew my mom pretty well, too. At least well enough to know that she was going to blow a gasket when she saw the red truck. No, not yet. Doug shook his head. When she gets back, she'll probably run him over with it. Have you heard from her? She phoned when she got to Cairo, but I wasn't there when she called. And it was just as well. I don't know if I could have stopped myself from spilling my guts about Sasquatch. So what are you going to do for spring vacation? Just hang around, helping my dad. Boy, that sure sounds like a lot of fun. The bell rang and Doug ran off to his next class. I was happy to see him go so I wouldn't have to make up more lies. Dad and I were going to spend spring vacation on Mount St. Helens. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. First, we had never ever even camped out in the backyard together. Second, the mountain could erupt again any day. That's why Mr. Rhodes had shown us the video. I was going to try to get a copy at the library and show it to Dad. Maybe the possibility of being buried under 600 feet of pyroclastic mud flows would dampen his Sasquatch tinkering. When school got out, I half expected Dad to be waiting for me out front again, but he wasn't there. I started walking home before Doug or any of my other friends came out. I was getting pretty fed up with the whole situation and wished Dad had never seen the Sasquatch or whatever he thought he saw. I just wanted my old, boring life back. My only hope was that after we spent a week suffering on the mountain, Dad would forget the whole thing and we'd get back to his normal insanity. Tinkering with the Titanic seemed pretty normal compared to this. After our dinner with Mr. Johnson, Dad went into the garage and sat in his chair for 3 days. This was the first time he had ever done anything like that. He didn't even get up to go to bed. He said he was working things out. Every time I checked on him, he was just sitting there, staring into space. He wasn't even reading a book. I figured that he was trying to let the Sasquatch idea go, as Mr. Johnson suggested, and that he was having a hard time doing it. So, you can imagine my shock when I got home and found Dr. Flagg, Joe West, Clyde Smithers, the clones, and a couple other guys in our living room. They were kneeling around a large map laid out on the floor. Dr. Flagg was the first to notice me. You must be Dylan, he said, standing up. He was shorter than I was, and dressed in the same khaki uniform he had worn at the church, and it wasn't getting any cleaner. Dad came out of the kitchen carrying a big bag of potato chips. Joe West took the bag from him without a word and tore it open. Hi, Dylan. How was school? Dad asked casually. What? He acted as if this group of Sasquatch hunters were at the house after school every day. No big deal. School? He repeated. Oh, it was fine, I said. Let's go into the kitchen and I'll tell you what's happening here. I'll come with you, Dr. Flagg said. I followed Dad into the kitchen with Dr. Flagg right behind me. Be cool, Dad whispered under his breath. What's that, Bill? Dr. Flagg asked. I said it felt sort of cool in here, Dad answered. I need to turn up the heat. Feels just fine to me, Dr. Flagg said. I joined the team this morning, Dad announced. It took every ounce of control not to shout, Have you completely lost your mind? Be cool, I told myself, and took a deep breath. Your father is a very important team member, Dr. Flagg said. He opened the refrigerator and pulled out a block of cheddar cheese. I watched in stunned silence as he opened several drawers until he found the one we kept the knives in. We're roommates. Isn't that great, Dad said before I could open my mouth. Terrific. I thought and looked at my watch. It was 2 a.m. in Egypt. I could catch Mom at her hotel if she wasn't in the desert digging up mummies. Dr. Flagg sat down at the table and sliced off a slab of cheese the size of a paperback book. Your dad tells me that you are very interested in Sasquatch. Well, not exactly. Don't be modest, Dylan, Dad interrupted. I told Dr. Flagg all about the Sasquatch research you've done on the web. I just stared at him. Before today, he thought a web was something woven by a spider. I need to get back in with the others, Dr. Flagg said. But before I do, I have a question for you, Dylan. Go ahead. Who have you told about the Sasquatch? I didn't see a Sasquatch. I'm not even sure if I... Dr. Flagg is talking about what we're doing. Who have you told about my seeing a Sasquatch and the plan to kill it? Harvest, Bill, Dr. Flagg corrected. Harvest. Harvest? He was talking about the Sasquatch like it was a ripe peach. Well, no one, I said. Not even your friends at school, Dr. Flagg asked. I shook my head. That's heartening news, Dr. Flagg exclaimed. Your father said you could be trusted. You see, we really need to keep this quiet until we come back with a cryptid. You're going to be hearing a lot of things during the next few days that we can't afford to have publicized at this point. Can I count on you to keep this to yourself for the time being? I nodded. That's the spirit. He walked out of the kitchen with his chunk of cheese. Dad, what's going on? Outside, he whispered. We walked out the back door and went into the garage, which looked like a staging area for a military invasion force. It was filled with sleeping bags, tents, radio equipment, rifles, boxes of cartridges, climbing gear, and other assorted gear. Where did all of this come from? I asked. It's for the expedition. I can't believe you joined them. It's the only way I can help the Sasquatch. He moved a stack of first aid kits out of his chair and sat down. What do you mean? Buck gave me the idea. I spent the last 3 days thinking about what he said. If this animal tried to help me, the very least I can do is try to help it. I had to join the team to keep track of what they were doing. I wasn't happy about this decision, but I was glad to hear he wanted to help Sasquatch, not kill one. Why are they all at our house? Buck was right about Joe's shack, he said. It's a miserable little place. Dr. Flagg wants the team to stay together until this thing is all over. He's afraid one of us will slip up and tell someone what we're planning to do, and the news media will get wind of the story. If the team lives in the same house and watches each other, no one will be able to blab. Seems a little paranoid to me, I said. Dad laughed. You don't know the half of it. This secrecy thing is just a small part of Dr. Flagg's master plan. He's written a Sasquatch procedural manual outlining every step for bringing a Sasquatch in. It's over 200 pages long. He's been waiting 20 years for the right moment, and he thinks this is it. The manual covers every detail from how to get a 700 to 2,500 pound corpse out of the wilderness to what to say to the news people when the team comes in with it. I looked around the garage. Well, they seem to be making themselves right at home, I said. How are you going to stop them? I have no idea. All I know is that I can't do it on my own. I want to get Buck involved somehow, quietly. What can he do? I don't know that either. I'm counting on you to find out. Me? Dad nodded. The team agreed that no one will leave the house alone, and that we're not allowed to make private phone calls either. Flagg has disconnected all the phones except the cordless, and Joe's carrying that around. They even took my cell phone. Sounds like you've been grounded. But you're not. You have to go to school. Tomorrow afternoon, I want you to go over to Buck's and tell him what we're doing. Aren't you forgetting something? What? The fact that Mr. Johnson is being watched? I don't know what that's all about. For all I know, it's related to this Sasquatch thing, which is why you'll need to get to his house without being seen, just in case. What should I tell him? Ask him if he'll stay near his phone for the next couple of days. I'll try to give him a call when I can, but it might be late. And how do I get to Mr. Johnson's house in broad daylight without being seen? There's an old alley that runs behind Cedar Street. It hasn't been used in years, and it's overgrown. All you have to do is follow it until you get to his house, then climb over his fence and knock on the back door. And now for the important question. Am I going on the expedition with you? I would feel a lot better if you stayed with Doug while I'm gone. Meaning absolutely not. And I was about ready to howl in protest when Joe West walked into the garage clutching the half-empty bag of potato chips. The cordless phone was clipped to his belt. I wondered how Dad was going to get a hold of it. What's happening? Joe asked with a full mouth. Just showing Dylan the gear. Well, Dr. Flagg wants everyone inside. Sure, Joe, we'll be right along. Joe reached into the bag, scooped out another paw full of chips, and stuffed them into his furry mouth. He waited for us to leave the garage, then followed us into the house. Chapter 6. It was more like a jungle trail than an alley. In some places I had to crawl on my hands and knees through the brush. When I spotted the wooden Sasquatch, I climbed over the fence. Before I knocked on his back door, I tried to clean some of the grime off of my clothes without much success. Mr. Johnson opened the door and glared at me. Hello, Mr. Johnson. I'm Dylan Hickok. We had dinner a few nights. I thought I told you to call me Buck. Sorry, Buck. Why did you come to the back door? I wasn't prepared for this question. And what have you been crawling around in? I took a shortcut? Why did you come to the back door, he asked again. Because your front door is being watched, I blurted out. How do you know that? I told him about going across the street during our first visit. What's inside there? Video camera, still camera, tape recorder, and a lot of empty pizza boxes. Bad diet. He didn't seem at all surprised or upset that he was under surveillance. So what do you want? My dad sent me. He needs your help. Well, maybe you should come inside then. I stepped past him and walked through the small, tidy kitchen into the dining room, which had been converted into an office. I was surprised to see an elaborate computer set up on his desk. He must have been on the web when I knocked on the back door because the page on the screen was still active. It was some kind of vitamin homepage. He switched the computer off before I got a good look at it. Let's go into the living room. I followed him into the other room and sat down on the sofa. The blinds were closed and he had to turn on a couple of lights so we could see each other. I bet you're hungry, he said. Yeah, I guess I am. I have just the thing. He limped off toward the kitchen. On the end table was a framed photograph of a pretty woman and a boy about my age. I wondered if they were Buck's family. Dad hadn't said anything about Buck having children. Across from me was an open door, and I could just make out a weight set and a couple of exercise machines. No wonder Buck was so fit. He came back with a plate of sliced carrots. I hadn't seen carrots since Mom left for Egypt. She would like Buck. Thanks. Good roughage, he said. Good for the eyes, too. I see you work out. I try, he said. It hurts a little more these days. I guess my bones are getting brittle. I was nervous, and I didn't exactly know how to start. An old clock was ticking in another part of the house. A trickle of sweat ran down my left side. I pointed at a photograph. Is this your wife? Betty. She's been dead a long time now. I'm sorry. I glanced at the closed blinds and thought it was a shame he couldn't keep them open. The room would have been a lot more cheerful with the sun lighting it up. Why are they watching you? This is not exactly how I intended to start out, but if Buck was bothered by the question, he didn't show it. It's not they, it's he, and it's not important. Peter Nunn, I said. Is that what he's calling himself? That's not his name. Buck shook his head. Didn't you say your dad needed help? Yeah. Well, let's stick to that for now. What's going on? I told him everything I knew, which wasn't much. They were going to divide into 3 groups. Each team was going to search a section of the area where Clyde saw the Sasquatch. And who were on these teams? Dad and Dr. Flagg are on one team, and another guy who hasn't arrived yet. I think he's a professional tracker or something. The 3 Smithers are on the second team. Joe West, Henry Polk, and Dean Voss make up the last team. So you're not going with them? I don't know. I hadn't had a chance to talk to Dad alone since the subject came up the night before. Originally, we were going to spend spring vacation up there, but things might have changed. Oh, things have changed all right. If I was your dad, I wouldn't let you set foot on the mountain with that crowd. Which is exactly why I thought I should go. Dad would be up there all alone, and there was no telling what he might try to do to help the Sasquatch. What are they going to do if they see a Sasquatch or come across some sign of one? Buck asked. All I know is the teams will be in constant radio contact. If they spot a Sasquatch, they'll try to surround it or kill it, or harvest it, as Dr. Flagg put it. Buck snorted in disgust. Such a pretty word for murdering a totally innocent animal in cold blood. I don't know about your dad, but the others are pretty good woodsmen. There's a chance that they might just pull it off this time. I assume your dad wants to stop them? Or warn the Sasquatch or something. I don't think he really knows what he's going to do. That's why he wanted me to talk to you. He's going to give you a call when he can, but it might be late. Joe West is in charge of security. He doesn't let anybody out of his sight for more than about 5 minutes, and he's carrying the only phone around on his belt. The tight security is part of Dr. Flagg's Sasquatch procedural manual. That's Flagg for you. He'll try to control it all as Buck ate a carrot. Do you have a computer and a modem? Yeah. Is it still hooked up to the phone line? I think so. Buck went into the dining room and came back with a scrap of paper. My email address? Maybe we can communicate that way. Great idea. All I had to do was sneak Dad into my room and show him how to send email. We sat for a while in uncomfortable silence. The only sound was a clock ticking in the other room. Is there anything else, Dylan? This was my cue to leave, but I didn't get up. There were about 100 things that I wanted to ask him. I picked up the photograph. Is this your son? Gary, Buck said quietly. Where does he live now? He died right after that photo was taken. I'm sorry. I decided to skip the how's your family chit-chat. Buck stood up. Well, if that's everything, Dad said you worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service. I was a field biologist, and when they thought I was too old for the field, they made me a desk biologist. I worked with endangered species, or as I like to think of it, I worked for endangered species. What happened to your leg? A fall, he said. A long time ago, and it's not my leg, it's my hip, but I still managed to get around. Have you ever seen a Sasquatch, Buck? I mean, aside from in your dreams? He limped over to the front window, parted the blind, and peered out. If you're thinking that your dad has lost his mind, you can relax. He hasn't. Well, that's not what I asked. He stepped away from the window. There are a lot of things in the woods that we don't know about, things we don't want to know about. This is one of the reasons people live in towns and cities. You still haven't answered my question, I persisted. Would you believe me if I told you I had seen a Sasquatch? It's something you have to see for yourself. Even Dr. Flagg understands this. That's why he wants to kill one and bring it in. So Dr. Flagg hasn't seen one either? Buck shook his head. Then why is he so sure that it exists? Dr. Flagg is a man of great faith. That's about the only thing he has going for him. Now, if you don't mind, I have a lot of things to do this afternoon. Tell your dad I'll need a map, and if he can swing it, one of the radios with the frequency they're going to use. I got up and started toward the front door. Hold up, Buck said. You better go out the same way you came in. I forgot. I wasn't looking forward to making my way back down the alley. He followed me into the kitchen. When I got to the back door, I stopped. So, why are you being watched, Buck? That's still none of your business. Chapter 7. When I got home, Dad was in the kitchen making spaghetti. Joe West was sitting at the table reading the newspaper and eating a bowl of cereal as an appetizer before the main course. I could hear the television in the other room. Joe looked up from the newspaper. When does school get out? Spring vacation's next week, I said. Nah, I mean, what time of the day does it get out? I don't know, I said. A little after 3. Why? Dad stopped stirring the sauce. Joe looked at his watch. It's nearly 5 o'clock. So? So where have you been? It's on. It's on! Someone shouted from the other room. Joe ran into the living room. Saved by the news, Dad said quietly. Are we set? Buck said he would help. Good. These guys are really spooky, Dad, and getting spookier all the time. But there might be some good news on the television, at least for us and the Sasquatch. The team was gathered around the television. A smoking Mount St. Helens was on the screen. Then they cut to the inside of a helicopter cockpit. It's too overcast to really see what's going on up here, the newscaster said from the chopper. But we understand from the passing jets that they have seen smoke breaking through the clouds at 14,000 feet. There have been 5 minor quakes at roughly 3-hour intervals today. Volcanologists say it's only a matter of time before the mountain erupts. Back to the studio. To help us understand more about this impending volcanic eruption is our own volcanologist, Dr. Paul Smales. Dr. Smales, will this be similar to the 1980 eruption that killed 57 people? I don't think it is certain right now that the mountain is going to erupt. The anchorman was obviously disappointed to hear this. Active volcanoes can spew steam and ash for 50 years without erupting, Dr. Smales continued. This is how pressure is released. It doesn't necessarily mean impending disaster. I had the feeling that Dr. Smales was not going to be asked to come back as their resident volcanologist. He was taking all the punch out of their lead story. But the earthquakes certainly, they mean seismic activity is perfectly normal in circumstances like these. There was always a tremendous amount of upheaval beneath the Earth's crusts. Earthquakes are simply a manifestation of this activity. Thank you, Dr. Smales. In other words, you're fired, Dr. Smales, I thought. Authorities are in the process of establishing a red zone boundary to keep people away from the base of the mountain, the anchorman continued. Once the boundary has been set, no one will be allowed in that area. Circling the red zone will be a blue zone. Only those with permits will be allowed in. Standing by with their own mini-cam in the town of Toutle River is Melissa Otis. Melissa? Hi, Jeff. It's pretty peaceful along the Toutle River right here. None of us, but those of us who were here during the 1980 eruption know that this can change very quickly. Melissa was about 22 years old, which meant she was 5 years old during the 1980 eruption. I doubted she remembered much about it. What have you learned, Melissa? The Disaster Committee is meeting right now in closed session to decide exactly where to establish both the red and the blue zone boundaries. This will affect not only the area's full-time residents, but also the timber industry that a small rural community is so dependent upon. Officials are trying to avoid a repeat of the tragedy of 1980 eruption where so many lives were lost. By the same token, they don't know if or when Mount St. Helens will erupt, and establishing these zones could have some serious economic ramifications for Toutle and other small towns around the mountain. Another concern voiced earlier today was by one official was the fact that spring vacation is starting next week for many schools. This could bring thousands of families to the mountain for a first-hand look. You might remember that during the 1980 eruption, many sightseers had to flee for their lives. Tragically, some of them were killed. The camera cut to the 1980 footage of locals and tourists arguing with officials manning the roadblocks. If at all possible, officials want to avoid a repeat of this kind of confrontation. The best thing to do is to stay away from the mountain for the time being. Looks like we'll be going up on the mountain sooner than we thought, Dr. Flagg said. We'll try to leave by tomorrow evening. We won't be ready, Clyde said. We have no choice. We must get up there before they establish the red and blue zones. What about the tracker? Joe asked. He'll be here tomorrow morning. What about me? I thought, but I didn't get a chance to ask because Dad and Dr. Flagg left in the red truck to pick up supplies in Eugene. Joe said they wouldn't be back until late. About 1 o'clock in the morning, I heard the truck pull into the driveway. 45 minutes later, I heard Dad come up the stairs and go into his bedroom. I wanted to make certain that no one heard us, so I waited another 15 minutes before sneaking across the hall and opening his door. The lights were off. Dad, I whispered. What the? The light came on, and Dr. Flagg came out of the bed like a jack-in-the-box. I was so startled I fell over backward. On my way down, I grabbed the cord of the lamp and it crashed to the floor. Dr. Flagg yelled and feet pounded up the stairs. Joe West ran into the bedroom, followed by Dad, Henry, Dean, and the Smithers. Someone flipped on the overhead light. Dr. Flagg was backed into the corner. He was pointing a pistol at me. What are you doing with that? Dad shouted. He stepped in front of me. Sorry, Bill, Dr. Flagg said, lowering the pistol. I didn't know it was your boy. Who did you think it was? You might have shot him. I thought Dad was going to hit him. I had never seen him this mad. I apologize, Dr. Flagg said it with an icy glare. They stared at each other. Flagg was the first to look away. He looked at me. What are you doing in here? I came to talk to my dad. You should have knocked. I stood. I didn't expect you to be in here. Clyde explained that what happened in sign language to his brothers, and the three of them went back downstairs along with Dean, Henry, and Joe West. Well, Dr. Flagg said, regaining his composure, I suggest we all go back to bed. It was just a misunderstanding. It could have been a lot more than that, Dad said under his breath, and followed me into my room, closing the door behind us. He sat down on the edge of the bed and covered his face with his hands for a few moments. Sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to cause a problem. It's not your fault. I had no idea Flagg slept with a gun. What's the matter with him? I can think of about 1,000 things. Dad smiled and took a deep breath. He looked exhausted, and I knew this was not the best time to bring it up, but I might not get another chance. I want to go up to Mount St. Helens with you. If it were just you and me, that wouldn't be a problem, but I can't let you go up there with these maniacs. I don't know if you've noticed, but these guys are pretty intense. Flagg just pulled a gun on you. He got up and started pacing. You have to understand that most of them have spent their whole adult lives searching for Sasquatch. They've been ridiculed and called insane. Bringing in a Sasquatch would change all that, to say nothing of the money they might make. Dylan, I don't know what's going to happen up there, but if they don't get their Sasquatch, if they don't get their Sasquatch, I'm not going to put you in the middle of it. But you don't have any problem putting yourself in the middle of it, I said. He picked a great time to change from mild Bill Hickok to wild Bill Hickok. Why couldn't he have done this when Mom was here? Believe me, he said, I'm having second thoughts, but it's too late to go back now. I'm not even sure if they would let me out at this point. How could they stop you? He didn't say anything. What are you going to do if they find a Sasquatch? I'm going to try to stop them from hurting it if I can. I'm hoping that Buck will be able to help me somehow. What am I supposed to do while you're on the mountain? Stay at Doug's. I'm sure his parents will let you spend spring vacation over there. I'll call them tomorrow. I'll take care of it, I said quickly. Thanks. He ruffled my hair, which he hadn't done in a long time. Don't worry about this, Dylan. We're going to go up there, see nothing, come back down, and it will all be over. The odds are in the Sasquatch's favor. No major expedition has ever seen a Sasquatch. All past sightings have been by pure chance. Why is Dr. Flagg sleeping in your room? I told him he would be more comfortable in my bed and offered to use the couch. I wanted to try to get hold of that phone while Joe was asleep. I need to talk to Buck. Actually, he's waiting for you to email him. I turned my computer on and explained how to send and receive email. That's all there is to it, he asked after sending a message to Buck. That's it. Buck will probably respond by tomorrow morning. He stood up. When this is all over, you'll have to show me more about this contraption. Sure. After he left, I stayed up for a long time thinking about what I was going to do. Staying at Doug's during spring vacation was not part of my plan. I checked the email before I left for school the next morning, but there was no word from Buck. When I got home, Joe was at the table making a couple of peanut butter and pickle sandwiches. Dad and Dr. Flagg walked in. Did you talk to Doug's folks? Dad asked. I'm all set. Good. Uncle John said he would come by this evening and take you over there. What was he talking about? I didn't have an Uncle John. What time is he coming by? Dr. Flagg asked. He said he thought he could make it by 8. Good, Dr. Flagg said. We'll be gone by then. He walked out the back door with Joe close behind him. The 2 peanut butter and pickle sandwiches were gone. They would need a semi-truck to carry enough food for Joe to eat on that mountain. Who's Uncle John? Mr. Johnson, Dad whispered. Buck, he emailed me this morning. I put aside one of the radios. Dr. Flagg didn't realize that the triplets only need 1 radio between them. He won't miss it. It's in your top dresser drawer with a couple of extra batteries and a charger that can be plugged into a cigarette lighter. There's also a rough map of the area each team is responsible for. What about the tracker? He's here. He flew in this morning, and he hasn't said a word since he arrived to anyone. He just sits in the living room chair and stares at the window. Scary. Who is he? His name is Kurt Skip. What about the red and blue zones? How are you going to get past the roadblocks? They haven't established the zones yet, which is why Dr. Flagg wants to leave now. He wants to get in before they restrict access. And what about the volcano? I wish it would blow and shut the whole thing down, but it doesn't look like it's going to. What if it erupts while you're up there? We'll be fine. Oh, yeah? Joe put his head through the back door. Dr. Flagg needs you in the garage. I'll be right there, Dad said. Joe didn't budge. I'm sure you and Doug will have a good time. I'm sure we'll have a blast. I swung through the living room to check out the new team member. He was sitting in a chair, staring at the window, just like Dad said. Next to him was a big green duffel bag with a long leather rifle case. The Smithers and the newspaper spread on the floor, and they were cleaning their rifles with solvent. If Mom saw this, there would have been a triple homicide. I walked up to the man sitting in the chair and introduced myself. He swiveled his head toward me in a slow motion. He was younger than I expected, mid-20s or so. He wore a polo shirt, slacks, and brown loafers. His blond hair was short and carefully combed. He looked more like a video game store clerk than a world-famous tracker. When his gray eyes finally reached mine, they didn't blink. Dylan Hickok, I repeated. He reached up and shook my hand. His grip was gentle, and his hand was surprisingly soft. Pleased to meet you, Dylan, he drawled. My name is Kurt Skip. Do you have an ironing board? At first I thought I hadn't heard him right. And spray starch, he added. I think so. I'll have to look. I hadn't seen an ironing board since Mom started back at school. I need to press some things for the trip. He still had it in my hand. So you're the tracker, I asked, pulling my hand away. Yes. What do you do when you find what you're looking for? He glanced at the rifle case. I guess the answer was inside of it. Where is the bathroom? He had sat in the chair all day without going to the bathroom. It's right down the hall, I pointed. Thank you, Dylan. Are you hungry? Maybe he had sat there all day waiting for someone to ask him if he needed anything. An apple would be nice if you have one. He walked over to the bathroom, slowly. If he moved like this on the Mount St. Helens, the Sasquatch had nothing to fear. I found the ironing gear in the back of the closet and set them up in the living room. Then I went to the kitchen to see if we had any apples. I kind of doubted it. Fruits and vegetables were things Mom bought, not Dad. But he surprised me. There was a bag of apples in the refrigerator, along with some other vegetables. Mom would have been shocked. Kurt had moved his duffel bag near the ironing board and was rummaging through it. He set out a pair of ankle-high hiking boots, thermal socks, gloves, and a jumpsuit made out of camouflage material. A real Rambo outfit. Here's your apple, I said. Are you sure you don't want anything else? We have plenty of food. No, Dylan, this will be just fine. He held the apple in the palm of his left hand and looked at it like it was some kind of precious jewel. He reached into his pocket with his right hand and came out with a large folding knife made out of stainless steel. He flicked his wrist and the blade flipped open. There was a blur over the apple and the knife went back into his pocket in a single motion. Would you like a slice? I didn't understand. The apple was still sitting on the palm of his hand, whole. He smiled, jiggled his hand, and the apple fell apart in 4 perfectly formed wedges. Go ahead, Dylan, take one. All I could do was stare. Kurt's legs might have been slow, but there was nothing slow about his hands. If he was as good with a rifle as he was with that little knife, Sasquatch was a dead cryptid. I'm not hungry, I managed to say. I've got to go up to my room and do some things. Well, it was nice to meet you, Dylan. Kurt put one of the wedges into his mouth and crunched it. When I got to my room, I found the two-way radio and map in my drawer. With any luck, these would be my ticket to Mount St. Helens.